Hello, welcome. My name is Monika Büscher. I'm Professor of Sociology at Lancaster University at the Center for Mobilities Research. And thank you very much for joining us for this final closing session for the first Decarbonate Real Zero conference. I hope you had a fantastic time. I really had. And I know Greg is there with a glass of something nice. Cheers, Greg. And I'm delighted to share this session, which I think will be amazing and fittingly future and action-oriented for a conference with our title, Real Zero in a Hurry. We have the Regional Youth Climate Assembly, who will talk about their brand new manifesto. And we have Mimi Scheller with a keynote on co-designing a post-carbon future. I'll introduce them more fully in a moment, but before we get started, there are a few things that I would like to say. First of all, thank you to all the presenters, the workshop and the panel organizers. It's been really intense, inspiring and enjoyable to see and hear you. So energizing to see all this work on decarbonizing at a time when the media are so depressingly, and the politicians are so depressingly silent on the climate crisis. Thank you. Then, critically, every conference is defined by a whole host of backstage activity. And I would like us all to give a huge, big thank you to Shona, Tina, and Kadam. If you could clap in the chat, or, you know, just imagine a roar of applause now, Shona, Tina, and Kadam. You've done an absolutely amazing job. This has been so enjoyable and so smooth. You're amazing. And you really make Decarbonate. And I know, Shona, you're doing it today on a sleepless night as well. So let's send you some extra love and appreciation. Another huge thank you to the Decarbonate co-investigators and theme leads and all the session chairs and keynotes. You've done an amazing job to orchestrate knowledge exchange and to inspire us throughout the conference. Again, thank you. And again, a huge roar of applause. That's one thing that we don't feel. And also a huge thank you to Greg Marsden, who is steering our Decarbonate ship with his huge knowledge, networks, and energy. It's a real intellectual and personal pleasure to work with you, Greg. And I've got something for you.
Too kind, Monika. That's an upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, we can't do it for real, but for all of you, you know, all imagine some flowers, some chocolates, and some champagne to celebrate for you tonight. So thank you. And yes, big whoop in the chat there. That's brilliant. Okay. So in terms of post-conference activities, many of you will be wondering about that. There are three things that I would like to highlight, and if there's anything else you can think of, please put it in the chat. All of the Decarbonate team hope that this conference is the start of new collaborations. Please get in touch with Shona, Tina, Kadam, or any of us at Decarbonate, or the people you've met here. Let's all work together and continue to work together. Then secondly, the Decarbonate team will take key messages from across this week to COP26 and will push home our message about changing our approach to real zero in a hurry. And we hope to see many of you at COP26. And then finally, further information on how we will package the conference for publication will be communicated in the next few weeks when we've had time to recover a bit from and Shona's had some sleep as well. Now, let's turn to this last fireworks session in support of Real Zero in a hurry. For the audience, please mute your mics unless you're speaking, unless you want to speak in the Q&A. Please use the chat to ask questions or make comments. And you can do that throughout the session, and the livelier you are, the better. So any ideas, any thoughts, please put them in the chat. If you have any technical problems, please contact Firefly, or if there are any other issues, then contact Tina or Shona directly with direct messages. The meeting is recorded, as have all meetings been through this conference. Okay, so I can see no questions, no anything that I need to do. Nope. So I think we're ready to get started properly. So there are two parts to this session. There's Mimi's keynote and the Regional Youth Climate Assembly. And first we hear from the Regional Youth Climate Assembly, Yorkshire, Humber, RYCA, as you say. And we have 5 people. Curtis Yip, if you could wave so that people can see who you are. Yeah, great, Curtis. Will Solomon, Sam Finn, Safa Sharif, and Tassos Kap. And I apologize if I've said your names not right. And it's over to you. So if you could share your screen, and then you've got 20-25 minutes, and then we've got some questions after that, and then we'll go into Mima's keynote. But yeah, over to you. Brilliant. And I'll shut up. And
hi, so my name's Safa. Good evening, everybody. I'll be talking you through the presentation today, but if at any point my Wi-Fi drops anything, I'm sure one of the other RYCA members will be able to just jump in. So hi, we are RYCA, the Regional Youth Climate Assembly. We started in April 2020. We formed online, and that's how we've been having our meetings since then. And our overall aim is to, help the environment and advocate youth voice in the climate crisis. So I'm going to pass over to Curtis to talk about what we have done so far.
Thank you, Safa. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting us. I think just first of all, it's quite good to mention that I've actually not met any of RYCA members in person. It's all been online. I think Will and Safa has only met each other once, I believe. So yeah, it's huge how and it's so great how such unprecedented times can, in a way, strengthen our relationships. But yet we're in such a disjointed world. But moving on to what we've done. So right at the very start, we went to lay down some aims and objectives. So that came into the creation of a manifesto. So we did some market research around the Yorkshire and Humber region within our individual youth councils. And then we constructed a manifesto covering 12 key pledges. We'll talk more about the manifesto a bit later, but just some other work we've been doing. We're a part of the Ripple Effect project. So that's a project of getting all young people, well, as many as possible, to video their experiences, thoughts and ideas of climate change, and sending it through to us so we can amalgamate and hopefully we've worked with University of Leeds, South Africa's Institute of International Affairs. So our movement's reached out internationally. We've also hosted workshops with the South African people across the UK. And we've also worked with a group of Northern Ireland to do that as well. We took part of a Dragon's Den kind of project with Decarbonate. That was one of the first things we did too. And again, we'll get onto that a bit later. We were invited to speak at many events, one of which was the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. That was very interesting because we were very young and everyone else was quite old, I should say. But in contrast to that, we have spoken at many young people's events too. So Barry Sherman MP, he reached out to us and asked if we could speak at a summer school he was doing for young people. So he spoke to young people there, and it was quite great really to hear other young people, what they their thoughts and ideas, because we're usually used to just speaking to adults and academics like yourselves and professionals. So it was very nice to speak to more young people. We also had interviews from the business deck, and yeah, I'll pass on to Will, who will talk about what we're working on. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis. So we're working on a lot of stuff, essentially. I mean, at the moment, the big highlight for us is working towards COP26, and through the ripple effect, through Leeds University, we've managed to get a workshop there. It's about an hour on the 8th of November, talking about ripple effect, how we made it, our experiences have made it. We're very excited about that, like really excited about that. I know Safar's the Northern Youth MYP rep, I think, is that your title? Yeah. So we're working towards that, designing everything, making sure we get everything ready for COP26 so we can have a broader range and as a consolidated youth voice as possible. We've also just been working to consolidate and improve youth voice across the region. The ACE Awards. ACE is the Advocates for the Climate and Environment Award, which is a name we spent a not inconsiderable amount of time on, which is a school accreditation being trialled in Calderdale in West Yorkshire and hoping to expand it, which focuses on climate education, green school buildings, canteens, biodiversity, transport, how kids get to school, how they get home. And you can get from bronze to platinum. We've partnered with Calderdale Council, Solar for Schools, and we're really proud of where it is. And we're really happy we're launching it at the moment. And hopefully we're going to get as many schools on board as possible. It requires youth leadership and youth voice in it and proper consistent change. We've been working on resource packs for it, climate education packs. So we're really proud of it. We've also been looking into things around agriculture. This is sort of one of the areas that interests us quite a lot. Sort of because there's no obvious solution to agriculture and climate change, if that makes sense. I know there's no obvious solution to anything, but and we've been invited to speak at many other events coming up. We're meeting with the Environment Agency next week on Tuesday. We're planning to work very closely with them. And then also we're developing our comms and everything that's happening. So our supporters, we've come across one of the big things with RYCA that we didn't really expect when we set it up was the amount of other people that wanted to speak to us, like Decarbonate. We're really happy you invited us to this. We think what you're doing is very, very important, and stuff like this needs to become more and more common. But we've worked with the People's Powerhouse, DCMS, COP26, Solar for Schools, the British Youth Council, the Ernest Cook Trust, the Yorkshire Climate Committee, Rotherham Youth Council, Sheffield City Region Youth Parliament, a lot of different people that we've managed to meet, speak to, get help from, and it's been really interesting. And then I think we're going to show you our manifesto video that Curtis made for us. That's excellent.
So that was the manifesto video, and yes, I like the support in the chat. That was Curtis who made that. It's absolutely amazing, and me and Will are always a bit surprised at how he can do something like that. I don't understand. So they just basically outlined what the 12 pledges were of the manifesto. We're going to skip past the Q&A just to make sure we have enough time to go through the entire presentation. But if you do have any comments or questions, put them in the chat and we'll try and refer back to them towards the end of this. So moving on to the next slide, please, Curtis. The Dragon's Den project. So we did this a few months ago and we were working alongside Decarbonate, and as you can see, it basically involved over 20 organisations applying for funding, and we would review these applications and then we'd express our opinions and ask questions we thought our constituents wanted, but also what we were thinking, all about young people and how we saw their projects and what we wanted to change about it, what we thought were good and bad and everything. I'm going to pass to any of the RYCA members to kind of speak about the experience. Did you enjoy it? Did you not? What were the things you liked about it?
I think one of the really sort of informative and interesting things that came out of these presentations and reading the sort of pitches they made was that you got to look at all the different ideas around transport and climate change and tackling it in the north, because they varied a lot. The sort of different things that they were looking at, there were ones that looked at were very data-based, ones that looked at very specific things, and just seeing all the different ways you could do it and all the different ideas people had that was really interesting. And it meant that going forward, we had these ideas in the back of our minds, stuff around, you know, e-cargo bikes and how people get around, what journeys are most important to people, which I think was really interesting. And it was a good chance to build our confidence a bit.
Yeah, completely agree. I think just can really thank Decarbonate for inviting us, for doing it really. It was such a great project, extremely insightful, and you know, we didn't realize, you know, how much potential research was happening in the north. You know, we don't hear this kind of stuff. We can't really access it through much of the media. It's all focused down south. One of the pledges in our manifesto is equal funding north and south. And not only did it provoke, you know, and help our insight, but we managed to share them as well. So there's been many times, when I was mentioning the Byron Sherman summer school they had to do, many young people were asking us about particular things. And RYCA actually brought some of the research to answer some of the questions of the young people. So it's again, you know, extending this, extending the research, extending the knowledge, helped us answer really what was going on in Yorkshire and Humber. So just things like that as well, really beneficial. I think it was great to provide youth input as well, youth influence to those academics, professors, and researchers as well. Extremely good conversations, and yeah, just thank you very much for inviting us to that project.
Yeah, so I'd have to agree with absolutely everything Will and Curtis have said. It was an amazing opportunity and we are very grateful, and so are all the other young people that were involved. I were really inspired. There were just things you would never have thought of that people came up with. And it were also, this isn't related to do with the environment and everything, but it helped our skills, like Will said, confidence. And we had to listen and take in everything they were saying and think about what our constituents would want and ask them questions. So it was really great at helping us become better at our roles. But yeah, so that was great. And once again, another thank you for doing that. Moving on again, I'll pass over to Tassos or Will to speak about transport.
Thanks, Savar. I think transport is one of these very interesting things in climate change, climate action, and everything RYCA does, because one of RYCA's sort of, I'm not sure what the word is, ethos, I don't know what the word is around how climate change should be a catalyst for further social and political change. That's what we should be doing here. And a better public transport system is something that young people have been asking for basically forever, whether or not that's to do with climate change or not. So it's about getting to school, getting to place making around accessing services. And so if you want to tackle climate change, you want more people to take public transport. So you improve the public transport system, which lets people, you know, get to school easier, access services better, meet people. It improves placemaking. And so it's one of these great intersectional issues that really, I think, attracts all of us to climate action. And so bus fares are one of these weird things that change everywhere you go. It's quite often it's done on like sort of metro, like West Yorkshire. It's very different to South Yorkshire. It's very different to Great Manchester, and all of them are very, very different to London. And it's around sort of essentially leveling up everything so it's easier and fairer. And so you can get from Sheffield to Manchester on a train or on a buses without needing 3 different tickets and having to pay again in different fares. And so it's makes it easier for people, and it's something that we're going to be working a lot with when it comes to the new mayors and the youth combined authorities. And it's the other thing with transport, it's one of the things that's very easily visualized in climate action. Quite often when you try and explain how much carbon something is, you say it's so many cars off the road by 2025. And that's why we're really interested in it.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, Will. Like again, you know, young people, before we had this, you know, urgency of climate change, before we even taught it or inherited it, you know, we always try to campaign on transport, mainly of the fares, mainly of the accessibility. And it wasn't until climate change, you know, the idea of climate change came to mind until, you know, the council and the organisation started to actually invest in transport. And because they did that and invested greener, we started getting fairer, you know, bus fares. We started getting more reliable transport and accessibility. Not perfect yet, but they're growing and they're getting better. But it's again adding to the sense of that climate change is more than just climate change, really, because it's teaching and forcing, you know, councils, organisations, and us to reconstruct the whole system, particularly in transport. And it's more than just climate change. It's about solving other types of issues and equality within it. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Safar.
So yeah, they've said everything I think we need to know about that. So on to the next slide. I don't know why Curtis passed back, but I'm going to be passing back to Curtis to speak about this.
Yeah, no worries. My previous point kind of links into, you know, young people and the engagement, you know, climate change has had on young people. The title of the talk is "It's More Than Just Climate Change," and that's particularly for young people. Well, first of all, young people have always been trying to advocate their voices, always been trying to be heard, but they've always failed because of the ignorance and lack of willingness, the reluctance of other people listening to them. And it isn't until climate change came to the agenda, the main agenda, where, you know, decision makers, adults, as we say, actually start to invite young people. It's one of the only issues in which we actually value young people in. And so what that does is it brings young people to the conversations, to the discussion of decision making. And we don't want it to end there. Once climate change is solved, or hopefully it will be solved, we don't want, you know, the young people's engagement, you know, the connection and the participation to end there. We want to invite them, you know, well, so we want the young people to be invited into the whole system and framework of how we communicate, of how we engage other people. It's more than just climate change, because, for example, when we're trying to solve food wastage, you know, how that contributes to climate change, you know, 4.4 million people in the UK struggle to eat. UK wastes over 10 million tons of food every year. We're not, you know, obviously we're trying to solve that, and which helps climate change, but it also contributes to the other type of issues and inequality of people who can't eat, and and the poverty of that. So it's this huge intersectionality, and young people are trying to bring their voices to the table through climate change, but they don't want to end there. We want to go further because we have other different types of groups. Many tackle on hate crime, many tackling on LGBTQ plus. We've got groups of them. RYCA is just one of the groups, and we've noticed that climate change is one of the only type of topics in which people are willing to get young people in. So our journey, as well as tackling climate change, is to also continue youth voice and our participation. And again, on the slides, it says it's improved our connection, it's improved the participation of young people in terms of political engagement, and it's the invitation of the whole youth community that we're trying to provide. I'm just looking at the time. We're going to show you one video, and it's part of the project, which it's part of the videos that we added to the ripple effect. And we thought, because we all quite well, we've not provided a diverse range of young people in the call today. We thought we'd had some primary school children who Will actually interviewed. I'll let Will explain more about it. Yeah, so this is it's I think technically my video in the ripple effect, but not really part of it. There's a school called Burnley Road Primary that got flooded majorly in 2015 and 2020 and 2019. And so this is just, I interviewed the year 6 class of them that got it the hardest, because I think their school got destroyed in the floods because it's right at the bottom of the valley. And then they came back to school after it got rebuilt, all nice. And then I think 3 months later, they all got sent home because of COVID. This is just 3 of the kids talking. I spoke to about 12, and they were really passionate, really interesting, and they did an incredible job. So this is Thomas, Maria, and Hannah.
I'm Thomas.
I'm Maria.
I'm Hannah. I remember the day when the morning where it flooded, and I was just in my room and I looked out and I saw it was just peeking over the river, and the military were there, and then I was just amazed, and I ran downstairs and said, "Mum, look outside," and she was like, "Oh my." And then we got everything together and we put it on like the table so it wouldn't flood, but yeah.
I remember the 2015 one, and my family put like everything upstairs because they thought it would flood, and I just like happened to look out my window, and there were these people on this lifeboat, and I saw them drag up this person onto it from the water.
And in the 2015 flood, I just remember waking up and my dad waking me up and saying, "You need to go to your grandparents because the house might flood." So we had to take me and put me in the car and drive me to my grandparents' house. But then the car ended up getting stuck somewhere, so we had to so then my granddad had to come and pick me up from the car because the car got stuck.
I just think that you need to think about you need to kind of think ahead. So when you hear the sirens, you need to don't just wait, just do it.
I'm really hugely delighted to welcome Mimi Scheller. I really couldn't think of a better person to draw things together and help us develop action plans for the work that is needed to push for real zero in a hurry. Mimi is really inspiring. Most recently with her work on mobility justice, she has really hit a nerve, and you talk about fairness and how it actually is in the fares of the public transport. And Mimi talks about mobility justice. And Mimi isn't just theoretically brilliant. She has just moved to a position where she's able to act on her insights in education of engineers and transport planners and infrastructure makers. So Mimi is inaugural dean of the global school at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. And until 2021, she was professor of sociology head of the sociology department and founding director of the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And she's founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities and past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility. She established the new mobilities paradigm and is considered to be a key theorist in critical mobilities research and Caribbean studies. She's published more than 125 articles and book chapters, and she's author of really groundbreaking books. Most recently, Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene, and Mobility Justice, the Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes. As before, please put your questions, your thoughts, links in the chat for the Q&A. And now I'd like to hand over to you, Mimi, if you could share your screen and then.
Yep, thank you so much, Monika. And, let me just get this on full screen. It's just a pleasure to join you, and I want to begin by thanking Monika and Greg and all of the Decarbonate team for organizing this, Shona, Tina, Kadam for all the support going on in the background, which has been awesome. I'm really pleased to be sort of sharing this stage today with Will and Safa and Curtis. Really inspiring to see what the Regional Youth Climate Assembly is doing, or Climate Action. And I changed the title of my talk a little bit because as I sat down to sort of concentrate on what I had to say, it was taking me so long to get to the end. I had to sort of focus it. So I'm going to speak today about what is called abolitionist decarbonization. And the context I'll be speaking about is inspired by work that I started when I was at Lancaster University. When I came there and began working with John Urry, back in 2000, we published a piece called The City and the Car, which was about this intersection of all these complex things, which I love the way Will described it as everything is interconnected. And it's a confusing and quite scary net of actions we need to take. And that was exactly our starting point now 20 plus years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. And that's kind of bringing me to the thread of thinking that I'll try to describe in this talk. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about mobility justice and the idea of kinopolitics. I've given many other talks on that before, and I didn't want to repeat myself, so that will be brief. But then I want to move on to carbon form and the abolitionist Green New Deal. And then thirdly, abolishing the carbon empire, democratizing infrastructure. And in the conclusions, I'm going to get more to this question of education and youth and how we can work together. So first, mobility justice. How do we bring in mobility justice? And when I published this book in 2018, I was trying to kind of articulate a set of ideas around the ways in which power and inequality are embedded in the governance and control of all forms of immobility, mobilities, which I see as always interconnected, and dwelling. So power creates mobility regimes, or it's contested through mobility regimes of differential and uneven mobilities and immobilities. And those are exactly, I mean, to put it in everyday language, those are the kinds of things that Will and Safa and Curtis were just talking about, like bus fares and the inequality and investment in different regions and the impacts of flooding on different groups of people. That's what I mean when I talk about uneven immobilities. Inequities of access and motility, motility meaning the sort of potential for movement or the control of other mobilities, being able to bring things to you. These inequities of access and motility are productive of differences of race, gender, class, age, ability. So it's not just that like people of different genders or races or class like have different kinds of access, but the access and the uneven motility are performative. they produce those differences. They draw those boundary lines. They're scripted into spatial relations and everyday practices. So then from that, we can ask who is able to appropriate the potential for mobility as a political question. What rights to mobility exist and how are they exercised and protected? But it's also an ethical question coming more out of the capabilities approach of what capabilities of motility are valued, defended, extended to all. So for young people or elderly people, right? What are their capabilities to be able to use the space that we've built around us? And are they excluded? And in what ways are people excluded based on different abilities, based on racial boundaries, based on citizenship status? So kind of thinking in that big framework, at bringing it back to sustainable mobility transitions and carbon questions, right? Decarbonisation, they have to involve not just what we do locally and sort of how we get around, what transport we use, but they also apply to these extended mobility regimes, urban systems, infrastructure spaces, and wider extractive zones, all of which together shape these larger macro mobilities at the planetary scale, which I'm going to refer to as carbon form. And so this is part of the arguments that are in the book Mobility Justice, but also I've been sort of working on extending them further. And in short, the argument is that the politics and power relations of immobilities, mobilities can be thought of as a politics of movement or kinopolitics. And behind that is this kind of way of thinking about mobility and immobility as relational, dynamic constellations of multiple scales, practices, and meanings. So scale, drawing on Doreen Massey's work, which influenced our thinking, as well as Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space. Scale is a social construction, and movement is that which makes and remakes space-time and entangles different scales. So like when we see the school in Burnley flooding, right? It's about the individual experiencing that, it's about the school, it's about the town, but it's about the whole region, and it's about the planetary climate that's bringing that kind of flood conditions. Practices are the ways in which social relations are assembled, stabilized, and moved. So practices, drawing on the social practice work of Elizabeth Shove, who was at Lancaster when I was there, it involves both these human and non-human immobilities and mobilities and infrastructures, and all the kind of everyday things we have around us, clothing and vehicles and what kind of houses we live in, right? And how we get to school. Those are all those different practices. And then thirdly, there's meanings. And this three-part structure draws on the work of Tim Cresswell, who kind of has really helped cement this argument that meanings are the ways in which we make sense of and tell stories about the particular space-time context that we inhabit, and that we transform through our ongoing lived mobilities and immobilities. So that's just to give like the sort of contextual background and the way of thinking that informs critical mobility studies. So bringing us up to, okay, the current moment. We're kind of living through and within and sometimes after the pandemic mobility disruption that we've experienced. And I wanted to just kind of talk about the ways we tell that story. And again, this question of meaning, what does it mean? So this is a graph of population adjusted changes in transportation from May 2019 to May 2021. And what we see here is a series of lines that begin in January 2020. And we see this plummet, right? So this is the beginning of the pandemic. And we see the steepest drop in air passenger miles, domestic air passenger miles. This is in the United States. They plummeted 95%. We see rail passenger miles in purple, also down this steep decline. We see public transit unlinked trips down this steep decline. Up above here, we see in blue the sales of cars and light trucks, and in green, the road vehicle miles traveled, and in red, the price of gasoline. And what's notable here as we move through time is that the ones that stay really down low at these depressed levels are rail passenger travel and public transit trips. They have not recovered. They're still more than 50% below what they were. What has recovered is the sales of cars and light trucks, which went skyrocketing, although it's come back down a little bit, and the road vehicle miles traveled. We see it has just come back to parity to what it was before. So it kind of shows us this really uneven impact and this uneven recovery, if you want to call it that, of car passenger travel, right? And so I know this is a depressing point to begin with, but I'm going to begin here, that the system of automobility is still growing. This is another way to tell that story. This is the predictions for the global annual passenger vehicle sales by whether they're battery electric, which we see the prediction is those starting to ramp up, plug-in hybrids, a little bit of fuel cells, but there's still a lot of internal combustion engine vehicles sold globally, and that's the gray bar. So here we are, you know, we fell during the pandemic, now we're starting to go back up again, and it's supposed to go up and up and up and up. And it's not until 2035 that electric vehicle sales might surpass internal combustion, but there's still a lot of internal combustion engines being sold. Additionally, I note on the bottom, if we also look at another way to narrate the story of what's been happening, the energy intensity per passenger mile flown in 2020 doubled from that in 2019. And that's because of the smaller number of people on each plane, also the use of less efficient models of airplane, and consequently flying passengers in 2020 contributed approximately twice the emissions per mile flown than those in 2019. So I want to just say that these are all different ways of sort of describing the current situation. They can also be disempowering, right? They can make us feel like we can't fix this, and how are we going to change this, and what are we going to do about that? And so I want to talk about the idea that's been advanced in the United States for a Green New Deal. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about what the Green New Deal is, but I just want to talk about why the Green New Deal needs mobility justice. And in general, the arguments like in the Green New Deal encapsulate the way many of us have been working to move beyond automobile dependence. And in terms of transportation, many cities have embraced mobility transitions, and that could be investments in electric trams and buses, bus rapid transit, bus priority lanes, open streets, protected bike lanes and cycleways, public charging networks for electric vehicles, shared bike systems and micro-mobility, e-scooters, all of that. And many of you at the conference have been studying, right, how that's happening, how it's being done in different cities, how it's contested, whether it's successful or not. All of that is happening. Nevertheless, what John Urry called the prevailing system of automobility remains dominant, not just in the United States, where it's absolutely still dominant, but worldwide, as I showed in those growth predictions, shaping our built environment, our cities, and how most people move around. And if we go back and try to understand that, we see that American automobility was bolstered historically through public investment in the interstate highway system, in the vast New Deal road building programs, in subsidies for fossil fuel extraction on public land, and tax breaks for car manufacturers. It was also racialized through federal policies that supported white flight from the inner cities, suburban sprawl, and then slum clearance, as it was called, by urban renewal programs that built highways and displaced Black communities, and also appropriated Native American lands and rivers. So this system I'm just describing of automobility it's not just a means of transportation, and it's not just a technology of energy use, right? It's not just about the fossil fuels, but it's an interlocking system of social practices, racial regimes, industrial and business networks, and ongoing relations between mobility, energy production, consumption, and land use, intertwined in a complex system that's heavily influenced by the powerful mobility regimes that work in the interest of kinetic elites. And I say this not to disempower us, but to know what we're up against, right? And I appreciate what Will was saying at the end of the talk by the RYCA group, because it's this recognition of the needs for a political movement. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So part 2, I want to talk about carbon form and the idea of the abolitionist Green New Deal, which is beyond the sort of current proposals for Green New Deals. So first of all, carbon form. What is carbon form? The material basis of energy, transport, and communication infrastructures coalesces into geographies of social relations, lived practices, and cultural meanings, as I've argued. And carbon form can be understood as the coalescence of our current energy culture as a way of life, a built environment, and an ideology of what Raymond Williams called mobile privatization. So Matthew Huber, who's written about the history of oil, argues that this particular cultural politics of kind of privatization and entrepreneurial life has become common sense. And it's made common sense because of the material transformation of everyday life, which centers on the single family home, private home ownership, automobility, and voracious energy consumption. And I'm showing here a couple of ads from kind of mid-century American, mid-20th century American publications from Mobile Gas, which shows the entire world in this droplet of oil. And it says, a new world is being born in America's petroleum laboratories. So they're proud of this achievement. And on the right, we see a company called General American. There's a factory in the background, and there's a molecule there, sort of petroleum molecule, and they're turning out petroleum-based products. You see plastics and kind of manufactured goods that are spin-offs of the petroleum industry. You see agriculture, you see oil drilling, you see forestry and packaging. So they understood what they were doing as a global project and one that touched every aspect of life. So it transformed the entire landscape. If we look at this great work by Reinhold Martin, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning at Columbia University, he talks about the oil system as it exists on the ground in the United States as carbon empire. And on one side, we can see the map for the interstate highway system, which was built on behalf of the Defense Department. They were interstate and defense highways, so it was a military industrial project. And then on the right, we see Gene Gottman's map for highway traffic flow in megalopolis, 1957 to 58. This is the creation of I-95, which runs from Washington down in the corner up through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, up to Boston, where and you'll see Worcester right near Boston, where I'm speaking to you from right now. That corridor, that megalopolis, is an example of carbon form. It's one of the key examples of this huge extended region that is completely urbanized, suburbanized, and kind of ex-urbanized. It's deforested, it's industrialized. It's now got huge growth of logistics warehouses, all the Amazon and Walmart delivery, centers, all of that, a massive amount of trucking, heavy goods vehicles, and that can be considered one huge extended region of this carbon form. So Martin, in this article called Abolish Oil, From Green New Deal to Green Reconstruction, it was published in June 2020 in Places Journal, he argues that to be truly transformative, a Green New Deal must take an abolitionist stance regarding oil and what we might call the carbon empire. So oil names this system of production that begins upstream, meaning in production terms, from the landscapes, cities, towns, buildings, and products that occupy the attention of most climate change mitigation strategies, right? So we're all focused on like, well, what products are we buying and what kind of houses are we living in and how can we change our towns and our cities? And he says, where these strategies typically de-emphasize collective action in favor of technocratic or consumerist solutions, oil abolition implies social transformation, systemic change that turns away from the devil's bargain between green austerity and corporate profit and toward collective freedom. So the idea of oil abolition builds on abolitionist democracy, which is an idea from the African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. And he argues that to reverse the dispossession by which the carbon empire governs, we must enlarge the historical frame beyond just the New Deal concept to the unfinished project of reconstruction. And reconstruction, it is based on Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction in America. It's a program of decarbonization as democratization. And to put that in more everyday terms, that's exactly what the youth were just talking about. They were talking about their exclusion from participation in democratic voting, decision-making, choosing leaders, picking policies, deciding what's going to happen. That's what decarbonization as democratization would call for. So how to abolish oil? Well, abolitionist decarbonization. This means rethinking decarbonization as abolition democracy in Du Bois's sense, not by region, but along the infrastructure, including highways, energy grids, and power sources that currently determine who will live and who will die on the color lines of climate change. And here I'm still quoting Reinhold Martin. The democratization, let's call it with Du Bois, socialization of energy infrastructures is a necessary step toward repairing the centuries-old damage wrought by the wages of whiteness, which include uneven exposure to ecological and environmental threats, as well as to economic precarity, voter suppression, police violence, and other manifestations of racialized injustice. So I love the way Martin has encapsulated this argument. It's an argument I've tried to make, I think less successfully. I really like the way he's described it here. And oil abolition forces this dialectic out into the open, reconnecting race with class along infrastructural lines. Oh, and here on the image, you see, again, a 1950s image of an automated car, right? Driving along a highway in a mobile privatization of a heteronormative white family life. Very much the images we still kind of see in some ways of automated driving. So if that's carbon form and that's abolitionist decarbonization, abolishing carbon form means democratizing infrastructure. So how do we do that? Or who's doing that? Where is that happening, right? So if we want to, I totally appreciate all the presentations that have been going on at this conference about working at the local level, changing places, bringing in kind of co-designed and cooperative community-based policies and transformations. And that's one level at which to do this. But I want to sort of expand our imagination to some other levels. So towards an abolitionist Green New Deal. Unequal mobility regimes and automobile dependence are not just green issues. They also contribute to racial injustice, gender and sexual inequality, health disparities, age discrimination, and the exclusion of people of diverse abilities from public space and from civic participation. We need to expand the social and political terrain upon which Green New Deal transportation policies are conceived and developed. We need to strengthen their commitments to mobility justice and widen our imagination of social change. So an abolitionist Green New Deal explicitly works to overcome the chronic disinvestment in communities of color, to dismantle the race, class, gender, and other barriers to mobility and to landholding, and repair the devastating impacts of past native dispossession, highway building, racial segregation, white flight, and the uneven health impacts of transport inequity, which include disproportionate rates of exposure to air pollution, to stress, which then has further health impacts, and as we've seen, to COVID-19. So who's doing this work? Well, social movements, beginning with this example of the movements against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and basically across North America, across Canada, the US, and other regions of the world as well, Native and Indigenous and tribal peoples on the front lines, like in the sort of, fence line communities, are the ones who have been fighting pipelines, drilling, mega dam projects, all the kind of infrastructures of mobility and transportation and fossil fuel and carbon form that they have had to live with. And it's not new to them. It's been going on for a long time, but these movements are the ones that have kind of brought this larger infrastructure space to public attention. So that's really important to begin with. Secondly, movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, which, I'm not going to go into the whole history of, but these are marches that were happening in the spring of 2020 during the COVID pandemic, where people were just so angry and so worked up about the killing of George Floyd, but many, many others as well, that despite COVID, they came out and marched for Black lives, partly linked to the question of mobility justice, which is the right of people to be on the street, to be in a car, to use public space without being harassed by the police. And it's what movements in the US today have referred to as, these forms of arrested mobility, to use the term of Charles T. Brown, which is that's part of this dominant mobility regime. That's part of the racialization of space, which has this deep history in America's carbon empire and is part of our lived existing carbon form. So I've written more about the movements of people for mobility justice, the principles of mobility justice published by a group called The Untokening. And they argue that historical disenfranchisement, disinvestment, disproportionate exposure to pollution, and repressive policing in communities of color continue to negatively impact our collective health, wealth, mobility, and security. So mobility justice demands that we fully excavate, recognize, and reconcile these historical and current injustices experienced by communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Now, I'm going to stop here and say, in the US, this takes this racialized form, and it also refers to immigrant communities, Latinx communities, as well as Native American, Indigenous, and Black communities. In the UK context, there's a different history of this. There's a different history of carbon form. And we can think about what are the forms of class disenfranchisement, disinvestment, disproportionate exposure, or to immigrant communities, right? So think about in UK contexts or in European contexts, how does the movement for mobility justice maybe have to play out along different historical lines, but with the same kind of arguments that could be informing it? So in the US, we've seen the emergence of these bicycle justice movements, movements for mobility justice, for urban transformation, that are highlighting the racialized exclusions of some of the current bike and environmental organizations, right? Whether they're promoting bicycle, infrastructure or Green New Deal infrastructure, they've been criticized for their exclusion of the concerns of racial justice and the communities that are most affected by the current carbon form that we have. So in previous work, I've talked about this question of who represents cycling cultures and for whom. So who is represented as biking, who defines the space, who makes policy decisions, who designs the infrastructure, what languages and imagery are brought to the table, and who is left out. And this is one photo I took of a night ride in New Orleans. And, you know, just thinking about when we talk about who we're building bike infrastructure for, or who's involved in active transport, who are we imagining? Who is it for? Who's making the plans around that? That's one of the sort of arguments that have been made about this local level, this sort of placemaking level, that it's been exclusionary. And organizations like Equiticity, which is based in Chicago, have also, you know, highlighted this question that mobility is justice, especially for communities of color. So just to sum up this section, to go back to Reinhold Martin's Abolish Oil, he argues that the unfinished business of Reconstruction, that is Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, might furnish a basis for confronting the social and ecological crisis of planetary warming. If actions to address the climate crisis stop short of transforming these material, cultural, and political economic infrastructures, sustainability will mean nothing but sustaining the inequalities of petrocapitalism. So if the Green New Deal is to decolonize the carbon empire, it must begin by exchanging the New Deal's river valleys, and there he's talking about the Tennessee Valley River Authority, for intersecting socio-technical networks and sub-networks. Democratizing oil infrastructures will require breaking the alliance of white suburban homeowners with fossil capital and the petro state. And I say that as a white suburban homeowner, right? I know how hard it is to break this system and how many people buy into this system still. And that's part of the political system that perpetuates it. So let me just draw this to a few conclusions. Abolition decarbonization must consider how we can prevent what's called low carbon gentrification. That is the argument that when you build good, livable, low carbon cities, it actually prices out poorer people who can't afford to live there. And it has to prevent climate colonialism and extractive sacrifice zones abroad, by which I mean things like the mining of metals on indigenous lands and the growth of offshore oil drilling in, you know, out of sight, out of mind places like off the shores of Guyana. We must transform not only the local embodied interactions of public space, streets, and transit, which I know a lot of you are focused on and is also very important, but also link it to regional patterns of land use, real estate ownership, and land holding by recovering what I call the mobile commons. And we also need to transform the transnational relations of resource extraction and energy circulation that underpin large-scale infrastructure transitions. So responses to the climate crisis and environmental injustices should include not only a shift to non-carbon fuels and new electric infrastructure, albeit those are good and they're the main current policy proposals on the table, but also a critical stance involving more socially just forms of life, new material assemblages of mobilities and dwelling, and more equitable distributions of infrastructure, clean energy, public transit, land, food, water, and affordable housing. To go back to this, you know, everything is interconnected perspective. We need to recognize the racialized harm and ongoing mobility inequities that have been built into our carbon form. We need to argue for infrastructural reparations to those who were harmed in the past and pay climate debt to those who did not produce global warming to the extent that those of us who live in the global north have. We need to shift planning power away from kinetic elites through the democratization and decolonization of both local and global decision-making. We need to restrain the overconsumption of energy and excessive travel by kinetic elites, for example, with carbon taxes or limits, you know, just strict, you know, this is it, carbon budget. We need to create rules for commoning, sharing, and caring mobilities that reduce harm, inequity, and injustice. And ultimately, we need to abolish carbon form, carbon capital, and the petro state. So I'll just finish up by saying, as educators, what can we do, right? That was like a big list of things to do, and you might be like, wow, where do we begin? And this is about place-based decarbonization. We're supposed to look at like what we can do here and now. So as an educator, I ask, what would an abolitionist decarbonized reconstruction look like for elementary, secondary, and higher education? And we heard some great suggestions already from the Youth Climate Action Group. Is this necessarily also a project of decolonization and epistemic justice? Like what do we need to be teaching and learning about in schools? And are we doing the right thing, right? Those of us who are educators. How can we train a new generation of diverse and inclusive STEM students? That's those students who are doing science, technology, engineering, math, the ones who are going to go out there and get the jobs to be the builders, the engineers, the experts, the scientists. How can we train them in community-centered, project-based learning for decarbonization, climate adaptation, and social justice? Can this be done both locally and regionally, but also nationally and globally? How can we develop transdisciplinary work that integrates ethical engineering, action research, community-based learning, and place-based climate action? Can academic mobilities, which many of us have benefited from, I mean, I know many of you because I've met you at conferences, can those mobilities be leveraged and also limited to commit to global cooperative projects and knowledge sharing on serious decarbonization? Like, can we say universities and professional organizations, if they're gonna have travel happening, it has to be towards cooperative knowledge sharing on serious decarbonization? Can we create a youth climate corps, kind of like the New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps, to energize this kind of change? Maybe a social movement like Black Lives Matter, like the indigenous and native tribal movements that we've seen happening across the world, or a social movement like the 1964 Freedom Summer to spread the word. And can we support more people's assemblies and more youth climate assemblies to democratize, who's involved in this process and how it takes place? So those are just a few of my thoughts and reflections on the themes of getting to real zero. What does it mean? What's real zero? How do we get there in a hurry, but how do we get there collectively and through social movements that can really make the kinds of change on a large scale that we need?